Good morning and welcome back to Data with Srini Voleti. I hope you are enjoying the journey so far. In previous lessons, we learned how to retrieve data using join, filter it using where, and organize it using order by. Today, we are taking the next big step in becoming a data analyst. Instead of looking at individual rows, we are going to learn how to summarize thousands of records into meaningful business insights. Let's begin with our business question of the day. Imagine you are working as a data analyst in healthcare organization company. One morning, your manager walks into your office and says, "We processed over 50,000 insurance claims this year. Can you summarize the total amount billed by each healthcare provider so I can quickly see who generated the most revenue for us?" That's a real business problem. Notice something important: your manager is not asking for all 50,000 claim records. They don't have time to read thousands of rows of data. They need a clear, concise report that highlights the most important information, and that is exactly why Group by exists. Group by allows us to organize related rows into groups. Then using aggregate functions such as count, sum, average, min, and max, we can transform raw data into meaningful summaries that support business decisions. On this slide, you can actually see the transformation. On the left, we have thousands of individual claim records. In the middle, SQL uses group by and aggregate functions to organize and summarize the data. And on the right, we end up with a simple business report showing each provider, the total amount billed, the number of claims, and the average claim amount. What once looked like overwhelming data now becomes information that managers can understand in just few seconds. Throughout this lesson, we'll build that report step by step. By the end of today's lesson, you will understand not only how to use group by, but more importantly, when to use it to answer real business questions with confidence. So let's get started and learn how to turn raw data into meaningful business insights. Why business summarizes data? In the previous slide, our manager asked us an important business question: can you summarize the total amount billed by each healthcare provider? Before we learn the SQL syntax, let us first understand why business needs summaries in the first place. Imagine trying to make an important business decision by looking through 50,000 individual insurance claims. That would take hours, maybe even days. More importantly, after looking at all those rows, you would probably still struggle to answer simple questions like which provider generated the most revenue, which provider handled the most claims, what is the average claim amount. Individual rows contain data. Business needs information. That is the difference. Let's look at the left side of the slide. Here we have raw claim records. Each represents a single insurance claim. Every row is useful, but by itself it tells only a tiny part of the story. Now look at the center of the slide. Instead of examining every individual claim, we summarize the data by healthcare provider. Now something is amazing happening. Instead of thousands of rows, we have one concise report. You can immediately see the total amount billed by each provider, number of claims submitted, average claim amount. This is exactly the kind of report that managers and executives every day. Now look at the right side of the slide. Once the data has been summarized, it becomes much more valuable. We can compare provider performance, we can identify trends over time, we can make informed business decisions, and we can create professional reports that everyone can understand quickly. This is why organizations don't simply collect the data, they transform data into information and information into action. That is one of the most important responsibilities of a data analyst. Finally, notice we are in our SQL processing flow. We have already learned how to retrieve data using from clause, combine tables using join clause, and filter rows using where clause. Today, we are adding the next major step, group by. Group by organizes related rows together, then aggregate functions calculate meaningful summaries for each group. Throughout the rest of this lesson, you will learn exactly how SQL performs that transformation. Let us begin by exploring the aggregate functions that make all this possible. Understanding aggregate functions. Now that we understand why business summarizes data, let us look at the tools SQL provides to make this happen. These tools are called aggregate functions. An aggregate function performs a calculation on group of rows and return one single value. Think about that for a moment. Instead of returning hundreds or even thousands of individual rows, aggregate functions give us one meaningful answer. That is exactly what business leaders need. Let's look at the 5 aggregate functions that every SQL developer and data analyst should know. Count. The first function count. Count is simply counts how many rows are in a result set. For example, if your manager asks how many insurance claims did we process this year, you don't count them manually. SQL does it instantly using count. Now next go for next aggregate function, sum. The second function, sum adds together all the numeric values in a column. If your manager asks, what is the total amount billed this year? Sum gives you that answer in a single calculation. Next function is average. Average, which stands for average, AVG stands for average. AVG calculates the average value in a numeric column. For example, what is the average insurance claim amount? Instead of calculating it yourself, SQL perform the calculation automatically. Next function is min. Min returns the smallest value in a column. If someone asks what was the claim amount submitted this year, that minimum amount submitted this year, it finds immediately. Max. Finally, we have a max. Max returns the largest value in column. For example, what is the largest insurance claim submitted? Again, SQL answers that question almost instantly. Now, notice something important. Every one of these functions return a single value. Without group by, they summarize the entire table. For example, count returns one total number of claims, sum returns one total billing amount, average returns one average, min returns one smallest value, max returns one largest value. Later in this lesson, you will see something even more powerful when we combine these aggregate functions with group by. SQL does not return just one answer, it returns one answer for every group. For example, instead of one total billing amount for the entire company, we'll get one total billing amount for each healthcare provider. That's what makes group by such a powerful reporting tool. Also remember the key points on that right side of the slide. Aggregate functions normally ignore null values, with one important exception, count star counts every row, including rows that contain null. Values in other columns. Finally, notice the example at the bottom of the slide. When we use sum of amount, SQL returns one number, the total number billed across all claims. That's beginning of the data summarization. In the next slide, we'll make these functions even more powerful, combining them with group by. Understanding group by, so far we have learned that aggregate functions like sum, count, and average can summarize data. But there is an important question. What if we don't want summary for the entire table? What if we want one summary for each healthcare provider? That's exactly where group by comes in. Let's begin with our business question. Our manager asks, how much has each healthcare provider billed in total? Notice the word each. That one word completely changes the question. We are no longer looking for one total amount for the entire company. We are looking for one total for every healthcare provider. That is the purpose of group by. Now let's walk through the slide together. Look at the table in the center. This is our raw claim data. Each row represents a single insurance claim. Some rows belong to City Care Medical, other belongs to Health Plus Clinic, other belongs to Wellness Hospital. At this point, everything is mixed together. There are no groups. Now SQL performs something very powerful. When we write group by provider name, SQL gathers all rows with the same provider name and places them into same group. Think of it like organizing paper into folders. All claims for City Care Medical go into one folder. All claims for Health Plans Clinic go into another folder. And all claims for Wellness Hospital go to in their own folder. Once these groups are created, SQL performs the calculation separately for each group. Sum calculates the total billed for each provider. Count calculates the number of claims for each provider. Average calculates the average claim amount for each provider. Instead of one answer, we now receive one summary row for each and every provider. That is the real power of group by. Look at the results table. Notice how each healthcare provider appears only once, but each row now contains meaningful business information. We can immediately compare providers. We can see who billed the most. We can see how many claims each provider submitted, and all of that comes from the same raw data we started with. We did not change the data. We simply organized it into meaningful groups. Now I would like you to look at the envelope analogy at the bottom of the slide. Imagine someone dumps hundreds of envelopes onto your desk. If they are all mixed together, finding information is difficult. So what you do, you sort them into separate piles, maybe by provider, maybe by insurance plan, maybe by month. Only after you have created those groups does it make sense to count them or total them together. That is exactly what SQL is doing group by simply organizing the rows before the calculation begin. Now let us look at our SQL processing flow. We have already learned from retrieves the data, join combines related tables, where filters the rows. Today we are adding new step group by. Group by creates the groups. Only after the groups exist do aggregate functions summarize each group. Finally, order by can sort this summarized result and select displays them. Understanding this sequence is one of the most important concepts of SQL. Remember the simple rule. Whenever you see group by, one group, one summary row. If you group by provider, you will get one row for each provider. If you group by insurance plan, you will get one row for each plan. If you group by month, you will get one row for each month. Once you understand this idea, group by becomes much easier to use. In the next slide, we'll start writing group by queries ourselves and see how SQL creates these summaries automatically. Group by does not change your data. It simply organizes it so SQL can answer bigger business questions. Now let's focus on group by multiple columns. In the previous slide, we learned how group by creates one summary for each healthcare provider. That answered an important business question, but in real organizations, managers often need to go one step further. Knowing the total billed by each provider is helpful, but sometimes it's not enough. They want a deeper level of analysis. Let's look at today's business question of the day. Our operations director says, overall provider totals are helpful, but I need to know how each provider performs under each insurance plan. Notice what different the question now has two dimensions, not just the provider, but the provider and the insurance plan. That means SQL has to organize the data into two different levels. Let's follow the story across the slide. We begin with thousands of individual insurance claims. Each claim contains information about healthcare provider, the insurance plan, the date, and the amount billed. By themselves, these rows don't answer our manager question. Now SQL begins organizing the data. The first level of grouping is by provider. Every claim, every claim belonging to the same healthcare provider is placed together. But we are not finished yet. Inside each provider, SQL creates another level of grouping. This time it separates the claims by plan type. Now each provider has smaller groups for PPO, HMO, Medicare, or any other insurance plans that provider is participating in. This is the key idea behind grouping by multiple columns. We are creating groups inside other groups. Once these groups are created, SQL calculates the summaries for every unique combination. Instead of one total per city care medical, we are now have one total for city medical PPO, another for city care medical HMO, and so on for every provider and every plan. Now our operation director has exactly the report needed to compare performance across different insurance plans by provider. Look at the business insights panel on the right. Without grouping by plan type, we only see the total for each provider. That tells part of the story, but once we include plan type, we gain much richer information. Now we can identify which insurance plans generate the most revenue for each provider. This is exactly the kind of detail that helps business negotiate contracts, allocate resources, and improve financial performances. More detail leads better decisions. Now let's take a look at the patient records an analogy. Imagine a hospital records room filled with thousands of patient files. First, the files are organized by healthcare provider. Then within each provider, they are organized again by insurance plan. Only after everything is organized, someone calculates total and prepare the final report. That is exactly what SQL is doing with group by. It organizes first, then summarizes. At the bottom of the slide, notice our SQL processing flow. The process has not changed. SQL retrieves the data, joins the tables, filters the rows, create the groups, calculate the summaries, sort the result, and finally displays the report. The only difference now is that group by is working with multiple columns instead of just one. I would like you to remember one simple idea from this slide. One group by column answers one business question. Multiple group by column answers deeper business questions. That's what allows data analytics to move from basic report to powerful executive dashboards. In the next slide, we'll continue building on this foundation and learn how to create even more meaningful business summaries. We're creating groups inside other groups. Combining where, group by, and order by. So far in this lesson, we have learned two powerful concepts. First, we learned how group by creates meaningful groups. Then we learned how aggregate functions summarize each group. Now it's time to put everything together. In real business reporting, we rarely use group by itself. Instead, we combine it with where and order by to answer very specific business questions. Let's begin with today's business question. Our manager asks, what are the total billed amounts by provider for PPO plans in 2024? Notice that this question has several requirements. We don't want every insurance plan. We only want PPO plans. We don't want every year. We only want claims from 2024. Then we want to summarize those claims by a provider. Finally, we want the providers with the highest totals listed first. This is exactly type of the question data analysts answer every day. Now let's walk through the process together. We always begin with the raw claim data. At this point, every claim is included. Different providers, different insurance plans, different years. Everything is mixed together. The first thing SQL does is apply the where clause. The where clause filters the rows. In our example, SQL removes every claim that is not a PPO plan. It also removes every claim that is not from the year 2024. Now we are left with only the rows we actually care about. Next comes group by. Now SQL takes the filtered rows and groups them by health insurance care provider. Notice that group by works only on the rows that survived the where clause. It never grows. It never groups rows that were already filtered out. That is an important concept to remember. Once the groups have been created, SQL performs aggregate functions. Sum calculates the total billed amount for each provider. Count calculates how many PPO claims each provider submitted during 2024. Each provider now has one summary row. Finally, SQL applies order by. Notice that we are no longer sorting individual claims. We are sorting the summarized results. In this example, the providers are sorted from the highest total billed amount to the lowest. This makes it very easy for a manager to immediately identify the top performing providers. Now look at the step-by-step diagram across the bottom of the slide. It perfectly illustrates SQL's logic workflow. First, from and join retrieves the data. Second, where filters the rows. Third, group by create the groups. Fourth, aggregate functions calculate the summaries. Fifth, order by sort the summaries. Finally, select displays the finished report. Understanding this sequence is one of the most important skills in SQL. If you change the order in your thinking, you'll often get incorrect results. Look at the reminder on the right side. I want you to remember one simple phrase: filter, group, aggregate, sort. Say it with me: filter, group, aggregate, sort. If you remember that sequence, you will understand how SQL builds almost every business report. This slide brings together everything we have learned so far. We are no longer writing isolated SQL commands. We are building complete business solutions, and that is exactly what professional data analysts do every day. The next slide will continue expanding these skills by solving even more realistic business reporting problem. Group by only works on the rows that survives the where clause. Professional SQL is not about memorizing the keywords. It is about following the correct sequence to transform raw data into meaningful business insights. Every great SQL report follows the same journey. Retrieve the data, filter what matters, organize it into groups, summarize it, and present the answer. Once you understand the journey, SQL becomes much easier to master. Joining tables and using group by together. Up to this point, we have learned two important skills. First, we learned how join combines information from multiple tables. Then we learned how group by summarizes data into meaningful groups. Now we are going to combine both techniques in one query. This is exactly how SQL is used in the real world. Very rarely is all the information you need stored in a single table. Instead, business organizes information across multiple related tables. As analysts, our job is to bring those tables together before creating meaningful summaries. Let's begin with today's business question. Our manager asks what is the total amount billed by each healthcare provider and how many unique patients did they serve during 2024? Notice something important. This question cannot be answered from a single table. We need billing information from claim table. We need provider names from the provider table. And we need patient information from the patient table. That means our very first task is to combine these tables using SQL clause join. Look at the middle section of the slide. Here we have three related tables. Claim table stores each insurance claim. The provider table stores the provider names. Patient table stores patient information. Each table contains only part of the story. The claim table tells us what happened. Provider table tells us who delivered the care. Patient table tells us who received the care. Join connects these three pieces into one complete data set. Now let's examine the SQL query. We begin with the claim table, then we join the provider table using the provider ID. Next we join the patient table using the patient ID. At this point, SQL has one complete data set containing claims, providers, and patients. Next comes the where clause. We filter the rows to include only claims from the year 2024. Remember, filtering always happens before grouping. Now we apply group by. We are grouping the data by provider name. That means SQL creates one group for each healthcare provider. Every claim belong to the same provider is placed into the same group. Now let us calculate our summaries. Sum adds together every claim amount for each provider. That gives us total amount billed. Next we use slightly different aggregate function. Instead of count star, we use count distinct patient ID. Why? Because one patient might have several claims. If we used count star, we do count every claim. But our business question asks how many unique patients did each provider serve? So SQL counts each patient only once within each provider's group. That's exactly what count distinct does. Finally, order by sorts the providers from the highest total billed amount to the lowest. This helps manager immediately identify the provider generating the most revenue for us. Now look at the workflow diagram at the bottom. Everything follows the same SQL sequence we have been practicing. First, join brings the data together. Second, where filters the rows. Third, group by creates the provider groups. Fourth, aggregate functions calculate totals and patient counts. Finally, order by sorts the summarized report. Every professional SQL report follows the same logical process. Now look at the result table. Instead of thousands of individual claims, we now have one concise summary row for each provider. Notice that every row answers multiple business questions at once. How much revenue did this provider generated? How many unique patients did they serve? This is exactly the kind of report executives use for planning, budgeting, and performance evaluations. Take a look at the think about box. It asks, why do we use count distinct patient ID? The answer is simple. A patient may visit the same provider several times during the year. If we counted every claim, we would count the same patient multiple times. Count distinct eliminate duplicates and gives us true number of patients served. This is an extremely common technique in business reporting. This slide demonstrates one of the most powerful patterns in SQL. Join gathers the information, group by organizes it, aggregate function summarizes it, order by presents it clearly together. These commands transform raw transactional data into valuable business insights. In the next slide, we'll continue building on this foundation by exploring even more advanced business reporting techniques. Common group by mistakes and how to fix them. Now we have learned how group by works and how to combine it with aggregate functions. Before moving on, let's spend few minutes looking at some of the most common mistakes beginners make. The good news is this: every SQL developer makes these mistakes at some point of time. The important part is not avoiding every mistake. The important point is learning how to recognize them and fix them quickly. Let us walk through them one by one. Mistake number one. The first mistake is selecting a column that is not grouped or aggregated. Imagine writing a query like this. You select the provider name. You also select the claim amount, But in your group by class, you only group by the provider name. SQL immediately becomes confused. It knows how to summarize the provider, but which claim amount should it display? The first one, the last one, the highest one? That's single correct answer. That's why SQL returns an error. The fix is simple. Every column in select list must either be inside an aggregate function or appear in the group by class. Whenever you see this type of error, ask yourself, is this column being summarized or grouped? Mistake number two. The second mistake is forgetting to use aggregate functions. Sometimes beginners write a group by query but simply list ordinary columns. The result is not useful summary instead. SQL returns multiple rows that don't answer the business question. Remember why grouping by exists. Purpose is to summarize data. With without sum, count, average, min or max, you are probably not summarizing anything meaningful. Always ask yourself, what value am I trying to calculate for each group? Mistake number three. The third mistake is trying to filter summarized values by using where. This is extremely common. Remember, where filter rows before grouping happens, but aggregate values does not exist yet. If you want to filter based on summary, such as providers total billing greater than $2,000, you must use having instead of. Here is an easy way to remember it. Where filters individual rows, having filters groups. Think of where as a filtering before the report is created. Think of having as a filtering after the report has already been summarized. Mistake number four. The fourth mistake is forgetting to include every non-aggregated column in the group by class. Suppose we select both provider name and plan type. We group only by provider name. SQL does not know which plan type belongs to that provider. Again, SQL has no single correct answer. The solution is simple. Add every non-aggregated column to the group by class. This keeps the query logical and removes the error. Mistake number five. The last mistake involves counting rows instead of counting unique values. Let us say one patient visits the same provider 5 different times. If we use count star, SQL returns 5. But our business question asks how many unique patients did this provider treat? Then the answer should be one patient, not 5 visits. That's why we use SQL in the SQL count distinct of provider IDs. Count count rows, count distinct, count unique values. Always ask yourself, am I counting transactions or unique people? Now look at the quick reference section across the bottom. Whenever you write a group by query, think through these 5 questions. First, what business question am I trying to answer? Second, what rows do I need? Third, how should I group the data? Fourth, what summary values do I need? Finally, how should I sort the results? If you answer these 5 questions, writing the SQL becomes much easier. Look at the reminder box. It summarizes the entire SQL workflow we have learned. Filter first, group next, aggregate third, sort last. Following this order keeps your queries organized and prevents many common mistakes. Finally, read the professional tip. Never write complicated SQL query all at once. Instead, build it one step at a time. Start with from and join clauses, check the result, and where clause, check again, then add group by and aggregate functions. Finally, order by. Testing your query after each step makes debugging much easier. Professional SQL developers use this approach every day. Let us put all things together. A complete reporting example now. Let us watch. Throughout this lesson, we have learned several powerful SQL concepts. We, we learned why business summarizes data. We learned how aggregate functions work. We learned how grouping by creates meaningful groups. We also learned how to combine group by with where, order by, and join. Now it is time to put everything together. This slide demonstrates how all of those pieces work together to answer real business question. Let's begin with today's business question. Our manager asks which healthcare provider had the highest total amount billed for PPO plans in 2024 and how many unique patients did they serve. Notice how much information this question contains. We only want claims from 2024. We only want PPO plans. We need provider names. We need billing totals. We need the number of unique patients, not the number of claims. And finally, we want the provider ranked from the highest billing to lowest. This is exactly the type of report executives ask almost every day. Let's think about how we'll solve this. First, we gather the data. The claim table contains billing information. Provider table contains provider names. Patient table contains patient information. Since no single table contains everything we need, we join the tables together. Now we have one complete data set. Next, we filter the data using the where clause. We keep only PPO claims from the year 2024. Everything else is removed. Notice how much smaller and more focused our dataset becomes. Now group by takes over. SQL creates one group by for every healthcare provider. Instead of looking at individual claims, now we are looking at providers as groups. Next come the aggregate functions. Sum calculates the total amount billed by each provider. Count distinct counts the unique number of patients served by the provider. Each provider has one summary row containing exactly the information our manager requested. Finally, order by sorts the provider from the highest total billed amount to the lowest. The most successful providers immediately appear at the top of the report. Without reading hundreds of thousands of rows, a manager can instantly understand the result. Now let us examine the finished report. Notice that every row represents one provider. We no longer see individual claims. Instead, we see meaningful business information. City Care Medical generated the highest billing. Health Plus Clinic served the same number of unique patients but generated less revenue. Family Health Center billed less overall but still treated multiple patients. These are not just numbers anymore. They are business insights. Now look at the business insights panel. This is where SQL becomes valuable. Instead of simply producing data, SQL helps answer important business questions. Which providers generate the most revenue? Which provider serves the most patients? Which provider may need additional resources? Which providers are performing exceptionally well? These are the kinds of insights executives use every day to make informed decisions. Now look at the try it yourself section. Once you have written one successful query, it's very easy to answer new questions. For example, what if we wanted only HMO plans instead of PPO? What if we wanted all insurance plans? What if we also wanted the average claim amount? Notice that we don't need to start over. We simply modify our existing query. Professional SQL developer constantly builds upon previous work. Finally, look at the workflow across the bottom. Every complex SQL report follows the same logical process. From gathers the data, join combines deleted tables, where filters the rows, group by create the groups, aggregate functions, calculate the summaries, order by sorts the final report, select displays the finished result. No matter how complicated your reports become, this workflow stays the same. The slide represents an important milestone. You are no longer writing individual SQL commands, you are solving complete business problems. That is exactly what data analysts do every day. And that is the real power of SQL. Our final slide will review everything we have learned in lesson 4 and prepare for the next exciting topic. Congratulations, you have completed lesson 4. Let us review what we have learned. Group by so far powerful reports. Today, you have learned one of the most valuable skills in SQL. how to summarize large amounts of data into meaningful business information. Instead of looking at thousands of individual rows, you can now create reports that answer real business questions in just few lines of SQL. Let's quickly review everything we have learned. First, what exactly is grouping by? Group by creates groups of rows that shares the same value in one or more columns. Instead of calculating one result for an entire table, SQL calculates one summary for each group. That's what makes group by so powerful. Next, let's review the key concepts. We learned that group by works together with aggregate functions like count, sum, average, min, and max. We also learned that where filter rows before the groups are created. Order by sorts the summarized results. And in our next lesson, we'll introduce having, which filters groups after they have been summarized. You are already building the complete SQL toolkit. Now look at the SQL processing order. This workflow is one of the most important things to remember. SQL follows the same logic sequence every time. From selects the table, join combines the related data, where filters individual rows, group by creates the groups, aggregate functions calculate summaries, order by sorts the summarized results. Finally, select displays the finished report. Whenever you are unsure why query is not working, come back to the sequence. It will solve many SQL problems. Now let us review the aggregate functions one last time. Count tells us how many rows exist. Sum adds numeric values. Average calculates an average. Min finds the smallest value. Max finds the largest value. These five functions from the foundation of business reporting, you will use them throughout your SQL career. Notice the example queries sometimes we group by one column, such as provider name. Sometimes we group by multiple columns, like provider name and plan type. Sometimes we count unique values using count distinct. The business question determines how we write the query. Always let the question guide your SQL. Now let's look at the best practices. Remember, every non-aggregated column in select must appear in group by. Use meaningful alias so reports are easy to read. Filter early with where whenever possible. Use count distinct when you count unique values. And always test your query step by step. Professional SQL developers build queries gradually, not all at once. It's equally important to remember the common mistakes. Don't select columns that are not grouped or aggregated. Don't forget to use aggregate functions. Don't use where to filter summarized results. Use having instead. Don't forget required grouping by columns. Add and remember the difference between count and count distinct. Avoiding these mistakes will save you hours of debugging. Before moving on, ask yourself the quick check question. Can you group by one column? Can you group by multiple columns? Can you use aggregate functions correctly? Can you count unique values? Can you filter before grouping? Can you sort summarized results? If you can answer yes to these questions, you are ready for more advanced SQL. Now look at the practice ideas. The best way to improve SQL is not reading, it is practicing. Take healthcare database we have been using, change the business questions, experiment with different group by columns, try different group aggregate functions, build your own reports. Every query you write builds confidence. Finally, look at what you can do now. You can build professional summary reports. You can compare business performance. You can analyze trends. You can answer management questions. And most importantly, you now understand how business transform raw data into useful information. That is exactly what data analysts do every day. This lesson is an important milestone. In lesson 1 to 3, you learned how to retrieve, filter, sort, and combines data. Today, you learned how to summarize the data into meaningful reports. These skills work together and together. They form the foundation of SQL Analytics. In our next lesson, we'll build on this foundation by learning having. You will discover how to filter summarized groups after aggregation, opening the door to even more powerful business reports. I'm excited to continue learning with you. See you in lesson 5.